Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. This is the Parallel Structure program. Now, I know this program deals with English, but let's begin with a little bit of math. Do you know what parallel lines are? They're lines that run in the same direction. Railroad tracks are parallel lines. So are the two side rails of a ladder. Now, in geometry, parallel lines are used to make squares and rectangles. In English grammar, we don't use parallel lines, but we do use parallel words and groups of words when constructing sentences. Parallelism refers to using words and groups of words that run in the same direction. In other words, words, phrases, and clauses that have the same grammatical form. As you'll learn in this program, some kinds of sentences require parallelism. We'll look at when and why parallelism is needed, and you'll learn some basic rules that will help you construct parallel words, phrases, and clauses to make your sentences as solid and sturdy as a well-built stepladder. The basic principle of parallelism is fairly simple. Here it is in a nutshell. Parts of a sentence that have similar meanings should be written in grammatically similar forms. Now, this principle is simple, but the specific applications of the principle are varied and somewhat complex. In the rest of this program, we will look at some more specific rules that grow out of this basic principle, and we'll look at many examples of sentences that require parallelism and look at exactly what this requirement means. Here's our first specific rule that will help you apply the principle of parallelism. When listing two or more things, qualities, or actions, describe them in parallel grammatical forms. One of the most common types of sentences that requires parallelism is one that contains a list. Very often when we're writing English, we have a need to list 3, 4, or 5 things in a particular sentence. And since all these items are on the same list, that means that they naturally have similar meanings. Since they have similar meanings and are being listed together, they should be written in grammatically similar forms. In other words, the same grammatical shape ought to be applied to each of the items in the list. When the same grammatical shape isn't applied to each item in the list, then the sentence sounds wrong, and we will have violated the principle of parallelism. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Read this sentence. America's founders were prepared to risk everything, their property, their reputations, and would even risk death. Now, in this sentence, as you can probably recognize, 3 things are being listed. After the colon, the 3 things that are being listed are things that America's founders were prepared to risk. Now, since we have a list of 3 items here, we have 3 things that are similar in meaning, and therefore they should be set up in grammatically similar form. Has that been done? Let's look at the 3 items that are listed in this sentence. First, their property. Second, their reputations. Third, and would even risk death. Now, are all 3 items written in grammatically similar form? Not really. The first 2 are written in the same grammatical form. Their property, their reputations. Here we have nouns, property, and reputations preceded by the possessive pronoun their. However, the third item is listed in a different form. Would even risk death. Suddenly, a verb has been inserted, would risk, and this changes the grammatical form. So the 3 items, even though they have similar meanings, are not being set up in grammatically similar form. Instead, that third item should be changed to match the other 2 in grammatical form. Since the first 2 items read their property, their reputations, the third item should read their lives. After all, that's what's being risked, their property, their reputations, and their lives. Notice that we have to change it from death to lives to make it parallel both in meaning and in grammatical form. So the correct sentence following the principle of parallelism ought to read, America's founders were prepared to risk everything, their property, their reputations, and their lives. If you want to emphasize the importance of that third item, you could use the adverb even and insert that as well without violating the principle of parallelism. You would simply be emphasizing that this third item in the list is the most important and dramatic of all. And the sentence could read, America's founders were prepared to risk everything, their property, their reputations, and even their lives. This sentence now fits the principle of parallelism, which applies whenever a sentence contains a list of similar items. Here's another example. A Marine recruit is expected to be physically fit, psychologically tough, and mature in his emotions. Now, once again, the sentence contains three items that are similar in meaning. And once again, the principle of parallelism has been violated. The first two items are written in grammatically similar form. Physically fit, psychologically tough. In both of these phrases, we have an adjective, fit and tough, preceded by an adverb, physically fit, psychologically tough. However, let's look at the third item in the list. Mature in his emotions is written in a different grammatical form. We do have the adjective mature, which describes what a Marine recruit is expected to be, but rather than being preceded by an adverb, like physically or psychologically, instead the adjective mature is being followed by the prepositional phrase in his emotions. Therefore, this third item in the list sounds different from the other two. It isn't set up in the same grammatical form. So once again, the principle of parallelism has been violated. We need to make a change to correct this sentence. How could you do it? Well, there's actually more than one way to correct it. Probably the easiest way to correct the sentence is to change the third item in the list so that it matches the other two. We could therefore rewrite that third item so that it contains an adjective preceded by an adverb. Now, if we want to do that, what would be the proper adverb to precede the word mature? Since the meaning of the sentence refers to mature in his emotions, it makes sense that the proper adverb to use would be emotionally. And the sentence would then read, a Marine recruit is expected to be physically fit, psychologically tough, and emotionally mature. Now the sentence fits the principle of parallelism. All three items that are being listed are set up in grammatically similar form. Now, in this case, we changed the third item to make it match the other two. We could also change the first two items to make it match the third if we wanted to. But then the sentence would contain longer phrases and would be a little less concise, and therefore wouldn't read quite as well. We could do that, however, if we want. The sentence could then read, a Marine recruit is expected to be fit in his physique, tough in his psychology, and mature in his emotions. I think you can see the sentence is a little less effective that way. It's more concise and therefore more effective to use the adverb-adjective form in all three items in the list. Either way is grammatically correct, however, because either way we would be following the principle of parallelism, which says that when items are being listed, we need to set them up in grammatically similar form. Here's another rule that will help you apply the principle of parallelism. Use parallelism to link related ideas and emphasize the relationships among them. Very often when we write English sentences, we are including two or more ideas in the same sentence that have some close relationship to one another. Sometimes those ideas help to prove or demonstrate the same point. In other cases, the two ideas may have a relationship of contrast, that is, they disagree with one another. In either case, it's desirable to follow the principle of parallelism, that is, to show and emphasize the relationship between the ideas by setting them up in grammatically parallel form. When you do this, your sentences read well, and the relationship between the ideas is very clear. The readers of your sentence will immediately see the relationship between the ideas and understand it, and will see how the ideas fit together. Here's an example. Love of country is admirable, but today it is necessary to love humanity in general. Now, this sentence is not grammatically wrong. That is, it doesn't contain an out-and-out error. However, it does violate the principle of parallelism, and therefore it's not as well written as it ought to be. How does it violate parallelism? Well, remember the rule we just looked at. When we have related ideas in a sentence, it's desirable to use parallelism to link them and to emphasize the relationship between them. This sentence contains two ideas. First, that love of country is admirable. Second, that today it's necessary to love humanity in general. In other words, to love people no matter where they come from. Now, the author of this sentence is setting up a clear relationship between these two ideas. The relationship is one of contrast. Notice that the conjunction but has been used to join these two ideas. The author is trying to say, one thing is true, but today something else is also true. So here are two ideas that are closely related and have a contrast to one another. And both deal with love of various kinds. So the two ideas are clearly related, and yet they haven't been set up in grammatically parallel form. The first clause says love of country is admirable. The second clause doesn't refer to love of humanity. Instead, it changes the grammatical form and says it is necessary to love humanity in general. Therefore, the two clauses are not set up in grammatically similar form. However, it would be easy to rewrite the sentence to make the two clauses parallel or grammatically similar. And when we do this, the sentence becomes much more forceful, and the contrast between the two ideas becomes much more clear. Here's how we would rewrite the sentence to follow this principle of parallelism. Love of country is admirable, but today, love of humanity is necessary. When we rewrite the sentence this way, the contrast between two kinds of love has been emphasized. Love of country, love of humanity. And we're told that the first kind of love is admirable, but that today the second kind is necessary. So the contrast between the two ideas and the author's point becomes that much more vivid and that much more clear. And that's why parallelism improves the sentence. So remember the rule. When related ideas appear in your sentence, try to follow the principle of parallelism in order to link those ideas and emphasize how they're related to one another. Our third rule, again, is not specifically a grammar rule, but rather a rule that applies as a principle of good writing. When using parallel construction, build to a climax. What does this mean? Well, as we've seen, parallelism is used to link ideas, and it's often used in particular when ideas are being listed, when 2, 3, 4, or more items are being presented in sequence. Now, the basic rule of good writing is that when you're presenting a number of ideas in a sequence, it's best to end with the most interesting, most important, or most dramatic item. If instead you end with an item which is less important, less interesting, or less dramatic than the preceding items, suddenly your sentence will sound a little funny. The idea that you're trying to get across will come a little flat, and the reader may even be distracted by the fact that there's been a sudden fall off. Rather than a steady climb in emotion, we have a climb and then a sudden decline, which is very distracting. It can be used for comic effect, but not when you're trying to write a serious sentence. Here's an example of a sentence that violates this rule of building to a climax. Visitors to America's heartland fall in love with the fields of waving grain, the endless skies, and the giant hamburgers. Now, if the author of this sentence was trying to write a humorous essay or make a funny remark, it might work, because the third item in this list, the giant hamburgers, sounds much less grand and exalted and serious than the first two, the fields of waving grain and the endless skies. Rather than building to a climax, this sentence gradually builds and then suddenly falls flat on its face, with the rather comic image of giant hamburgers being thrown in alongside the grandeur of American landscapes. So the author of this sentence has not built to a climax, but instead has fallen down at the last moment, and therefore the sentence sounds rather funny. Now, if you're trying to write humor, then by all means use this technique, because it does create a comic effect. But when you're trying to write a serious sentence, remember this rule: build to a climax and make the items in your list get gradually more important, more impressive, and more dramatic. And that way you will leave the reader with the most emphatic item and therefore have the greatest effect on the reader's feelings. Let's try now an exercise that will enable you to test your understanding of the basic rules that we've looked at in this lesson. Turn to your study guide, try your hand at the sample sentences that are given there, and when you're finished, come back to this program, and we'll take a look at those questions together. Now, we gave you 5 sentences, some of which have errors in parallelism. Your job was to detect whether there is an error in parallelism in the sentence, and if so, figure out how to correct it. Let's take a look at the first example. Just as Darwin revolutionized biology with his theory of evolution, Einstein's theory of relativity revolutionized physics. Now, this sentence demands parallelism because it contains 2 closely related ideas. Here, the 2 ideas are related because they describe similar happenings. The first clause, the first half of the sentence, talks about Darwin revolutionizing biology with his theory of evolution, and in the same way, we are told, Einstein's theory of relativity revolutionized physics. So in both clauses, similar revolutionary happenings in a particular branch of science are being described. So we have closely related ideas which ought to be described in grammatically similar form. Now, has that been done in the sentence the way it's written? The answer is no. The principle of parallelism has been violated. Look at the difference between the 2 clauses. The first clause says, Darwin revolutionized biology with his theory of evolution. The clause begins with the name of the scientist, Darwin, and it ends with the prepositional phrase, with his theory of evolution. The second clause is not set up in the same way. It doesn't begin with Einstein. Instead, it refers to Einstein's theory of relativity, and the clause does not end with a prepositional phrase. To make the 2 clauses parallel would strengthen the sentence by making the relationship between the 2 ideas that much more clear. Why don't we rewrite the second clause to make it match the first clause grammatically? Just as the first clause begins with the name of the scientist, the second clause should begin with Einstein. The first clause says Darwin revolutionized biology. Let's make the second clause read Einstein revolutionized physics. And then we'll end that second clause with a prepositional phrase, just as the first clause ends with a prepositional phrase. So the rewritten sentence, which would follow the principle of parallelism, would read, just as Darwin revolutionized biology with his theory of evolution, Einstein revolutionized physics with his theory of relativity. Notice how the sentence seems clearer and crisper. The ideas and their relationship become that much clearer when the principle of parallelism is followed. Let's take a look at the next example. Coach Jabbar demands 3 things of his players: hard work, that they have personal integrity, and self-discipline. Now, here we have a list of 3 things, the 3 things that Coach Jabbar demands of his players. And whenever 3 or more things are being listed, we want them to be set up in grammatically parallel form. Has that been done here? No, not quite. The first and third items in the list look similar grammatically: hard work, self-discipline. Here we have nouns preceded by an adjective: hard work, self-discipline. Self-discipline is a hyphenated word, but in effect it's the same form, an adjective preceding a noun. However, the second item in the list is not set up in the same way. Instead, it's a clause, that they have personal integrity. If we want to make all 3 items grammatically parallel, we'd like to change that second item so that it matches the first and the third items. And actually, that's easy to do. Remember, the first and third items in this list both consist of an adjective followed by a noun. We can easily change the second item into that same form, adjective followed by noun, simply by using the words personal integrity. So the corrected sentence would read, Coach Jabbar demands 3 things of his players: hard work, personal integrity, and self-discipline. Doesn't the sentence sound much crisper and more forceful when it follows the rule of parallelism? I think so. Let's look at the next example. Thrilled by the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, thousands of prospectors rushed to California, traveling by boat, by covered wagon, and walking. Once again, we have a list of 3 items in this sentence, and since all 3 have similar meanings, all 3 should be set up in grammatically parallel form. But once again, the rule has been violated, which means once again we'll have to make a change to correct the sentence. The 3 items that are listed are the 3 ways that prospectors traveled to California at the very end of the sentence: by boat, by covered wagon, and walking. Now, the first 2 items are in similar grammatical form. We have the preposition by, followed by the mode of transportation: boat, covered wagon. However, the 3rd item in the list is not in the same grammatical form. Rather than beginning with a preposition followed by the mode of transportation, instead we have what's called a gerund, an ing form of the word, walking. That's not the same grammatically, and therefore it doesn't seem to fit with the other 2. Parallelism has been violated. What could we do to change that 3rd item so that it's as similar as possible to the other 2, so that it begins with the preposition followed by the mode of transportation? Could we say by walking? Yes, but that doesn't sound quite right. A more common or idiomatic prepositional phrase that describes walking somewhere would be on foot. So that would probably be the best way of rewriting this 3rd item. Notice that the preposition is different. The first 2 items would have the preposition by, while the 3rd item would have the preposition on. But nonetheless, it sounds parallel because in each case you have a preposition followed by the mode of transportation. So one good way of correcting this sentence would be to end it with the phrases by boat, by covered wagon, and on foot. And that would give us the feeling of parallelism that we're looking for by having 3 items all set up in the same grammatical form: a preposition followed by the mode of transportation. The exact word doesn't always have to be the same as long as the grammatical structure or form is the same. That's what parallelism is all about. Let's look at our next example. Each of these 3 poets is admired for a different quality: Milton for his grand rhetoric, Shakespeare for his sweeping vision, Chaucer for his simple humanity. Once again, 3 items have been listed here. Now, have they all been set up in grammatically similar fashion? That is, has the principle of parallelism been followed? Well, the answer is yes. This sentence doesn't contain an error. Let's take a look at how the writer of this sentence was careful to follow the principle of parallelism. He's listing 3 poets and the quality for which they are admired. And let's look at how each of these phrases was set up and notice how parallelism was maintained. In each case, the phrase begins with the name of the poet: Milton, Shakespeare, Chaucer. And in each case, what follows is a prepositional phrase that describes the quality for which that poet is noted. And in fact, the parallelism goes even further than that. Within the prepositional phrase, the author has been careful to follow the same grammatical setup, that is, by ending the prepositional phrase with an adjective and a noun: grand rhetoric, sweeping vision, simple humanity. So we have a very strong parallel feeling as we read through these 3 phrases, and I think you'll find that it's not only very clear, but also sets up the similarities and contrasts between the 3 poets very vividly, so that by the time you read the 3rd description, it feels rather satisfying, the way everything clicks into place, almost as when a musical piece ends with a nice chord in which all the tones of the orchestra fit together neatly. The sentence reads clearly and vividly because parallelism has been followed so effectively. So this is the sentence in our exercise that doesn't need any correction. It's perfectly correct as written because the author has been very careful about parallel structure. One more example. I agree with Hung Wei's political views, but his way of expressing them is something I don't agree with. Now, this sentence is not really bad, but it is less effective than it could be because it violates the principle of parallelism. Let's take a look at how it could be improved. Here we have two related ideas. They're related by contrast. The first idea differs from the second idea. In the first idea, the author is describing something that he agrees with about Heng Wei, namely his political views. The second clause is describing something the author doesn't agree with, namely the way Heng Wei expresses them. So we have two ideas that are in contrast to one another. The author agrees with one, disagrees with the other. Now, the relationship between the ideas and the contrast between them would become much clearer if parallel structure would be used. And again, it's easy to revise the sentence to make that the case. Let's rephrase the second clause so that it matches the first grammatically. The first clause says, I agree with Heng Wei's political views. How would we begin the second clause to make it as similar as possible grammatically? Well, the first clause begins, I agree. Why not begin the second clause with, I disagree? Then the rest of the clause is easy to write. The revised sentence could simply read, I agree with Heng Wei's political views, but I disagree with the way he expresses them. Notice that the sentence is a little more crisp, a little more concise, and the contrast between the two clauses is a little clearer when parallelism has been used. This sentence is a good example of how parallelism goes beyond the strict question of grammatical correctness or incorrectness and also gets into the realm of writing effective and powerful sentences that convey your ideas clearly and vividly. If you get good at parallelism, you'll find that your writing will improve and people will be more impressed with your ideas because they'll come across that much more crisply. Okay, we've seen that parallelism is necessary when a sentence contains a list of similar items or when it contains ideas that are closely related to one another. Let's talk now about some of the most common errors in parallelism and how to recognize and correct them. Sometimes the best way to recognize problems in parallelism is with your ear. Sentences with parallelism problems will often sound a little funny. With practice, you can recognize when parallelism errors occur in your sentences because they don't sound quite right. Here are some specific examples of what to watch out for. First, avoid mixing words, phrases, and clauses. If you begin a list or a group of related ideas with words, you need to continue them with words. If you begin with phrases, they should all be phrases. If you begin with clauses, then they should all be clauses. Problems arise when writers switch between words and phrases or between phrases and clauses. Let's look at this example and you'll see what I mean. The films of Stanley Kubrick are visually striking, intellectually challenging, and with a strong satiric content. Here again we have a list of 3 qualities that characterize the films of Stanley Kubrick: visually striking, intellectually challenging, and with a strong satiric content. Now, perhaps your ear can tell you that this sentence hasn't been constructed with parallel structure. The 3 items in the latter part of the sentence aren't set up in similar or parallel grammatical form. The first is a phrase, visually striking, that consists of an adjective, striking, preceded by an adverb, visually. The second item is similar, intellectually challenging. Once again, we have an adjective, challenging, preceded by an adverb, intellectually. However, the third item is not a similar 2-word phrase. Instead, it's a prepositional phrase beginning with the preposition with and ending with the words a strong satiric content. So we have a noun, content, preceded by 2 adjectives, strong and satiric. Therefore, we have a 2-word phrase, and then a prepositional phrase. We violated parallel structure by mixing words, phrases, and clauses incorrectly. To correct this sentence, we would want to change the third item in the list and make it match the other 2 by making it a simple 2-word phrase consisting of an adjective preceded by an adverb. There are probably a couple of different ways of conveying the same idea and following parallel structure, but here's one way the sentence could read. The films of Stanley Kubrick are visually striking, intellectually challenging, and strongly satiric. Now we have parallel structure because the same kind of two-word phrase has been repeated in each of the three items. Here's another example. The scholarship committee selected Mai Ling because of her academic record, and she is an outstanding athlete. Now here we don't have a list, but we do have two closely related ideas. That is, two reasons the scholarship committee selected Mai Ling. The first reason is her academic record. And here we have a short phrase consisting of the possessive pronoun her, the adjective academic, and the noun record. However, the second item, which is similar, the second idea, which is the other reason why the scholarship committee selected her, is a clause. She is an outstanding athlete. Remember, a clause contains a subject and a verb, and here we have the subject she and the verb is. So we have a phrase matched with a clause, and the two just don't match. They aren't parallel to one another. Once again, we'll need to rewrite one of these in order to create parallelism, and we could change either one. Let's change the second one and turn it into a similar phrase, similar to her academic record. Again, there's probably more than one way of writing this, but here's one way of correcting the sentence that would make it parallel. The scholarship committee selected Mai Ling because of her academic record and her athletic accomplishments. Now, both phrases are simply phrases. Neither one is a clause, and we haven't mixed and matched unmatching parts. Instead, the two ideas are set up in grammatically parallel form, and now the sentence sounds right. Here's another hint as to what to look for to avoid an error in parallelism. Avoid mixing gerunds and infinitives. Actions are often described using either the gerund form of a verb or the infinitive form of the verb. The gerund form of a verb ends in ing, and a gerund can often be used basically as a noun, describing a particular kind of action. The infinitive form of the verb is the simple or base form of the verb. It sometimes is used with the word to. And the infinitive form of a verb can also be used more or less as a noun to describe a kind of action. So both gerunds and infinitives can be used in a similar way in a sentence, but they sound different. They are grammatically not parallel, and therefore to mix them with one another in a list or when similar ideas are being presented would create a parallelism error. Here's an example. My favorite outdoor activities are camping, fishing, and to hike. Perhaps your ear can pick up on the parallelism error here. Three activities are being listed here. The first two are described by using the gerund form of the verb, the ing form, camping, fishing. In both cases, we've taken the verb to camp or to fish, added ing at the end, and it becomes a gerund, which we can treat as a noun, a name of a particular kind of activity. However, the third item in the list has been described not using a gerund, but using an infinitive, the base form of the verb, in this case with the word to in front of it. Now, to hike can be used as a noun, and therefore it's correct in and of itself, but it's being mixed and matched incorrectly here, matching an infinitive with two gerunds, and therefore we violated the principle of parallelism, and that's why the sentence sounds a little weird. The easy way to correct it would be to change that third item in the list so that it's also a gerund, and the sentence could then read, my favorite outdoor activities are camping, fishing, and hiking. Here's another tip as to what to watch out for to avoid a parallelism error. Avoid mixing active verbs and passive verbs. Now, active and passive verbs can both express similar ideas, but they are grammatically different. Most sentences are written with active verbs. In an active verb, the subject of the verb is the one who is doing the action. When a passive verb is used, the subject of the verb receives the action. So, for example, if I say, I cut my leg, I'm using an active verb because the subject of the verb cut is I. I am the one doing the action. On the other hand, if I set up that same idea using a passive verb, I might say, my leg was cut. Notice the difference. My leg is the subject of the verb, and it is receiving the action of being cut. That's the difference between an active verb and a passive verb. Now, both active verbs and passive verbs are perfectly correct, and depending on what idea you're trying to convey, you may want to choose one or the other in a particular sentence. However, it's generally not a good idea to mix active and passive verbs in the same sentence, and in particular, when you're describing ideas that are similar, related, or parallel to one another, you want to avoid mixing active and passive verbs. The result, if you do mix them, would be a sentence that doesn't sound right. There will be a lack of parallelism, and the reader will think, there's something a little odd about this sentence, even if the reader can't identify it grammatically. Let's take a look at this example. When making an apple pie, first slice the apples, then they should be mixed with sugar and lemon juice. Now here, two actions that are part of the process of making an apple pie are being described: the slicing of the apples and then the mixing of the apples with sugar and lemon juice. The problem is that the first verb here is an active verb, slice the apples, in which you, the actor, are doing the action, you're slicing. But in the second clause, the verb is set up in passive form. They should be mixed with sugar and lemon juice. They, the subject of the verb, is the apples, and they are passively receiving the action of being mixed. So in this sentence, we've mixed more than just apples, sugar, and lemon juice. We've mixed active and passive verbs. And that's why the sentence doesn't sound quite right. To correct this sentence, you'd want to make both verbs parallel. And generally speaking, when all things are equal, it's usually better to use an active verb rather than a passive verb. So my recommendation for correcting this sentence would be to change the second clause so that it contains an active rather than a passive verb. Making the two verbs match would give us a sentence that reads like this: when making an apple pie, first slice the apples, then mix them with sugar and lemon juice. Notice how the sentence becomes a little more crisp, a little more concise, and also a little clearer when the two verbs in the sentence are made to match, when both are active rather than having one active and one passive. And here's one more tip that will help you avoid a common error in parallelism. Sentence elements linked with the coordinating conjunctions either or, neither nor, and not only but also should be grammatically parallel. Now, you remember that conjunctions are words, usually short words, that link other things in the sentence. Sometimes they can link words, sometimes phrases, sometimes clauses. One particular type of conjunction is the coordinating conjunction, which actually consists of two words. The two words in a coordinating conjunction are always used together to link different parts of the sentence. And when coordinating conjunctions are used, what follows each of those words should be grammatically parallel. So whenever you say either or, what follows either should be grammatically similar to what follows or. In the same way, whenever you use neither, what follows neither should be grammatically similar to what follows nor. And again, when you say not only, what follows that grammatically should be grammatically similar to what follows but also. Let's take a look at a sentence that contains one of these coordinating conjunctions and see how the rule applies. Some scientists believe that dinosaurs resembled birds not only in their physical structure, but also their social habits. Now, at first glance, this sentence might seem okay, but if you listen to it carefully, you might hear that parallelism has been subtly violated. Here's why. We're using the coordinating conjunction not only, but also. And remember our rule, what follows each of those conjunctions needs to be the same grammatically. Let's check and see if it is. First we have not only. What follows that are the words in their physical structure. Now this is a prepositional phrase, beginning with the preposition in, ending with the noun structure, and containing the possessive pronoun their and the adjective physical in between, in their physical structure. Okay, then we have the conjunction but also, and what follows that is their social habits. What do you notice that's different? Well, what's missing here is the preposition in. Because this is not a prepositional phrase, parallelism hasn't been followed. It's very close. Their social habits is quite similar to their physical structure, but because the preposition has been omitted, we don't have a prepositional phrase. And so what follows each part of the coordinating conjunction is not exactly the same grammatically. And that's why a careful reader will notice, or at least hear, that parallelism has been subtly violated. Luckily, it's easy to correct this error simply by inserting the preposition in into that second phrase after the coordinating conjunction but also. And then the expectation that we will have parallel structure will be nicely satisfied and the sentence will sound good and sturdy the way it ought to. The correct sentence would then read, "Some scientists believe that dinosaurs resembled birds not only in their physical structure but also in their social habits." Now, there is one other way in which you could correct this sentence. That would be by moving the preposition in so that it preceded the coordinating conjunction. And then what follows each part of the coordinating conjunction would be the same grammatically. Let's take a look at how the sentence might then read. Some scientists believe that dinosaurs resembled birds in not only their physical structure, but also their social habits. Now, notice that what follows the two parts of the coordinating conjunction is the same in each case. Their physical structure, their social habits. We've moved the preposition in so that it encompasses both. And that would be another perfectly correct way of changing this sentence. So you have your choice as to whether to insert the preposition in each phrase or move it so that it's not necessary to have it in either phrase. That's completely up to you and is a matter of your own ear or taste for writing. The most important thing, however, is to make sure that what follows each part of the coordinating conjunction is exactly the same grammatically. Otherwise, you will have violated the principle of parallelism. So whenever you find yourself writing a sentence that contains one of these coordinating conjunctions, it's worthwhile to pause, go back, reread the sentence, and consciously make certain that you've created parallel grammatical structures after each part of the coordinating conjunction. It's a very common writing error, but one that's easy to avoid now that you know the rule. Let's turn to the study guide. We've provided you with an exercise that will give you a chance to test your understanding of the rules we've just talked about. Our first sentence contains a list of 3 activities that were done on a vacation, but you'll notice that the principle of parallelism has been violated. Let's see how we could correct this sentence. We spent our days in St. Petersburg touring historic churches, magnificent art museums, and admiring ornate palaces. Okay, 3 activities are being listed here, and let's look at how each one is described grammatically. Touring historic churches, magnificent art museums, and admiring ornate palaces. Of these 3 items, 1, 2, and 3, which ones are similar? Well, the first and the third seem to be similar, don't they? In each case, the phrase begins with a gerund form of a verb, touring and admiring, followed by the things that were toured and admired, the historic churches, the ornate palaces. The second item, however, is in a different grammatical form. Here we have magnificent art museums, describing what was visited, but with no gerund form verb preceding it. We have a couple of different ways that we could correct this sentence. One way of correcting it would be to change item 2 so that it resembles the other 2 grammatically. So, for example, we could rewrite the sentence to read as follows. We spent our days in St. Petersburg touring historic churches, visiting magnificent art museums, and admiring ornate palaces. That would be one perfectly good way of correcting the sentence. Another way of correcting it would be to eliminate the ing, the gerund form of the verb, from our third item. And what would then happen, you'll notice, is that the ing gerund verb from the first item would apply to all 3. All 3 items would then be parallel, but in a different form. The sentence could then read as follows, and listen closely and hear how the parallelism works. We spent our days in St. Petersburg touring historic churches, magnificent art museums, and ornate palaces. Now, the ing verb touring applies to all three things, and what follows touring are three parallel phrases describing three places that were toured, which is also a perfectly correct way of making the sentence parallel. So notice that the principle of parallelism doesn't tell you exactly how you must write a sentence. Often there's more than one way of following the principle. It's up to you which path you choose. Either of the two possible corrections would be perfectly all right, and you should consider yourself correct if you wrote the sentence in either of those ways. The only thing that we know is wrong is the way the sentence is originally written, where we've mixed phrases that don't match and therefore violated parallelism. Here's our next example. The doctors moved quickly to wash the wound, disinfect it, and applying a sterile dressing. Do you recognize the rule that we violated here? Remember our rule not to mix gerunds and infinitives. Here we have three different actions being described: the washing, the disinfecting, and the applying of a sterile dressing. The third one, applying, is being described with a gerund, the ing verb. But the other two are described with the base or infinitive form of the verb. The easiest way to correct this is to make all three into infinitives, and the sentence would then correctly read, the doctors moved quickly to wash the wound, disinfect it, and apply a sterile dressing. That way, all three actions are described using the infinitive form of the verb, and parallelism has been maintained. Let's look at the next sentence. The hardwood floors in the old house were stripped, sanded, stained, and sealed with varnish. Does this sentence sound all right to you? Actually, it is perfectly correct. Parallelism has been maintained here. The list of actions that are being described as things that were done to the hardwood floors in the house, all those actions are being described using the same form of verb: stripped, sanded, stained, and sealed. The last item, we've added the prepositional phrase with varnish, which is necessary to complete the meaning. But the feeling of parallelism is not lost. So this sentence is perfectly correct. This is one that doesn't need any changing in order to create that feeling of parallelism. Next example. In 1968, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago, and the Republicans held their convention in Miami. Now, what's wrong with this sentence? Well, the problem is a subtle one. Here we have two actions being described that are quite similar or parallel, related to one another. However, the first one is described using a passive verb, and the second one using an active verb. Notice the first clause, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago. Here we have the subject of the action, of the verb, the Democratic Convention, passively receiving the action of being held. However, the similar action described in the second clause is described using the active verb. Here, the subject of the verb Republicans is actively conducting the action or performing the action of holding the convention. So to correct this sentence, we could go either way. We could make both verbs passive or both active. If we made them both passive, then the sentence would read, in 1968, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago, and the Republican Convention was held in Miami. Or we could make them both active, in which case the sentence would read, in 1968, the Democrats held their convention in Chicago, and the Republicans held their convention in Miami. Either correction would be perfectly okay. It's your choice as to whether to use a passive verb or an active verb. The only real mistake is to mix and match both kinds of verbs in the same sentence. That's when we have a problem with parallelism. And our next example. Either the snowstorm must stop within the next 2 hours, or the town festival will have to be postponed. Here we don't have a parallelism problem. We have a second sentence in this exercise that's perfectly correct. We're using coordinating conjunctions here, either or, and what follows should be as grammatically similar as possible. And what follows in both cases is a clause, and since the two are roughly similar grammatically, the feeling of parallelism is not violated. What follows either is, the snowstorm must stop within the next 2 hours, that's a clause, And what follows "or" is the town festival will have to be postponed. Another clause. The two are basically similar in form, and therefore the sentence sounds perfectly parallel. Remember that what follows, the two parts of a coordinating conjunction, must be similar grammatically in order for parallelism to be maintained. This sentence follows that rule, and therefore it's correct, doesn't need any changing. Well, so far we've looked at some of the basic rules about using parallelism correctly. In this lesson, we're going to scale some of the heights and get into one of the more difficult aspects of parallelism, namely using ellipsis. Now, ellipsis is when certain words are omitted from a sentence. Ellipsis is used to avoid needless repetition. Now, when a word or a group of words is used more than once in the same sentence, the word or group of words may sometimes be omitted, but this must be done correctly. Now, in parallel constructions, repeated words may be omitted after one use, provided the omitted words are the same words and they can be understood quickly and easily. What does this mean? Well, it means that when you're setting up a sentence with parallel constructions, so you have different parts of the sentence set up in the same grammatical form, rather than repeat all the same words each time you use the parallel construction, you may omit them. However, it has to be done in accordance with this rule that the omitted words are the same words and can be understood quickly and easily. To test whether you're using ellipsis correctly, you need to reinsert the same omitted words and make sure the sentence makes sense. If it does, and if the missing words can be understood quickly and easily, then the sentence is okay and you've used ellipsis correctly. Otherwise, you need to rewrite the sentence. Let's take a look at a couple of examples that may make this rule a little more clear. Here's a sentence in which ellipsis has been used correctly. Labor has agreed to cooperate with management, and management with labor. Okay, here we have a sentence that has two closely related ideas. Labor has agreed to cooperate with management, and the same is being done in reverse by management with labor. Two closely related ideas which are being set up in parallel form. However, in order to save space and to avoid unnecessary repetition, the author has left out some of the words from the second example of the parallel construction. In other words, the author of this sentence is employing ellipsis. After all, if you think about it, the sentence, when fully filled out, if the ellipsis were eliminated and the omitted words were reinserted, the sentence would read, labor has agreed to cooperate with management, and management has agreed to cooperate with labor. That's what the sentence is saying. And when we fill out the parallelism and plug the omitted words back into the second half of the sentence, we see that we have parallel structures. The two halves of the sentence are written in exactly the same grammatical form. Now, notice that when we reinserted the omitted words into the second half of the sentence, it did make sense. It was grammatically clear and understandable. And I think that when the words are omitted, the sentence can still be understood quickly and easily. Therefore, this sentence passes the test. It is a correct use of ellipsis because when the same omitted words are reinserted into the sentence makes sense. And when they are taken out, it can still be easily and quickly understood. So this is an example of good ellipsis. Labor has agreed to cooperate with management, and management with labor. The omitted words from the second half of the sentence still leave the sentence quite clear, and exactly the same words can be reinserted, and the sentence makes sense. Here's another example of a sentence containing ellipsis. Without pleasure, life is intolerable. Without purpose, meaningless. This sentence has been written to be very pithy, very concise. It's a short, kind of philosophical statement. And one of the ways the author has made this sentence pithy and concise is by using ellipsis. He has left out some words from the second half of the sentence. Once again, we have two clauses set up in parallel fashion, but in order to avoid repeating the same words, the author has omitted certain words from the second half of the sentence. Let's test to see if ellipsis has been done correctly here. Remember that our test is to insert exactly the same omitted words and make sure that the sentence makes sense once those words have been inserted. Let's try that and see if the sentence makes sense. Without pleasure, life is intolerable. Without purpose, life is meaningless. The words that were omitted from the second half of the sentence were life is. When we reinsert exactly those same words into the second half of the sentence, it does make sense. And I think the sentence is clear and easy to understand without them. Therefore, once again, this sentence passes the ellipsis test. We've got two parts of the sentence with parallel construction, and the author is using ellipsis to make the sentence that much more pithy, concise, and short. And it's quite effective the way it's been done. And when we apply the test of reinserting the omitted words, the sentence still makes sense, so this is a perfectly correct use of ellipsis. Now, once again, to test ellipsis, you want to mentally complete all the clauses in the sentence and make sure that they're logically and grammatically parallel. If not, you have to revise the sentence to either fix the parallelism or rewrite it to eliminate the use of ellipsis. That is, simply fill in the ideas so that the sentence makes sense. It's very easy to make mistakes with ellipsis, as we'll see in a couple of examples now. Here's a sentence where the author is trying to use ellipsis to avoid repeating words, but when we try to apply the test, we see that it doesn't really work. For generations, fishing boats have and do navigate the waters of Chesapeake Bay. Okay, we understand what the author is trying to say. He's trying to say that fishing boats have navigated the waters of Chesapeake Bay for generations, and they still do that today. So there are two parallel ideas being described here. And they could have been written out in parallel structure clauses. Instead, however, the author is trying to use ellipsis to make the sentence shorter by leaving out the repeated words. However, does he pass the test of correct ellipsis? To test that, we have to plug in the same words that have been omitted and make sure that the sentence makes sense. Now, in the second clause here, we're told fishing boats do navigate the waters of Chesapeake Bay. That's the complete clause. When we try to insert the same words into the first half, suddenly the sentence doesn't really work. For generations, fishing boats have navigate or do have navigate. You see, when you try to insert those words, do navigate, into the first part of the sentence, we see it doesn't really work. The reason being that the same words don't work in the two clauses. Remember that with the helping verb have, you need to use the past participle form of the verb navigate, namely navigated. So the sentence, the first clause here would have to read, fishing boats have navigated the waters of Chesapeake Bay. So inserting the same omitted word navigate doesn't work in that first clause. And that's an example of how ellipsis can go wrong. Ellipsis only works when the exact same word has been omitted as appears elsewhere in the sentence. In this case, when you try to insert that same word navigate, the sentence doesn't make sense grammatically. And that's why you can't really use ellipsis in this way. To correct the sentence, you would have to rewrite it to eliminate the ellipsis. One way of doing that would be to simply flesh out both clauses, and then the sentence would read something like this. For generations, fishing boats have navigated the waters of Chesapeake Bay, and they still do navigate the waters of Chesapeake Bay. Now, this is rather long and awkward, and that's why the author wanted to use ellipsis in the first place. He realized that writing out both of those clauses would create a sentence with a lot of repetition. Unfortunately, the way he did the ellipsis didn't really work. A better alternative would probably be to greatly shorten the second clause so that the idea comes across without using incorrect ellipsis. So a better way to write this sentence would probably be something like this. For generations, fishing boats have navigated the waters of Chesapeake Bay, and they still do. By changing the sentence altogether so that there's no attempt at ellipsis, but instead we simply have two different verbs being used to describe the past and the present activity in Chesapeake Bay, the sentence is now clear and the incorrect ellipsis has been eliminated. Very often when you've got an ellipsis problem, you simply have to start from scratch, in effect, and retool the sentence altogether to avoid the problem. Here's another example. No true warm water fish could exist in the Arctic, and certainly could not thrive there. Okay, again, two parallel ideas are being described. No true warm water fish could exist in the Arctic, which makes sense because the waters in the Arctic would be cold. And then in our second idea, warm water fish certainly could not thrive there. Okay, so far so good, but the author has tried to use ellipsis in the second clause in order to avoid repeating the words warm water fish. However, here's the problem. When we reinsert those omitted words into the second clause, suddenly it doesn't make sense. Here's why. Remember, the rule is you have to reinsert the exact same words. The sentence would then read, no true warm water fish could exist in the Arctic, and no true warm water fish certainly could not thrive there. Notice what's happened to the logic. We're saying that no warm water fish could not thrive there. The two negatives in that second clause create an explosion. The sentence no longer makes sense. The author is trying to say that a warm water fish could not thrive there, but the words omitted from the first clause are no true warm water fish. So it doesn't pass the ellipsis test. You have to be able to reinsert exactly the same words and have it make sense. So therefore, the ellipsis doesn't work here, and what you have to do is go back to the drawing board and really rewrite the sentence. One way of doing it, for example, might be, no true warm water fish could exist in the Arctic, and a warm water fish certainly could not thrive there. Once again, this is rather repetitious and lengthy, and probably not the best way of correcting the sentence. So you might want to retool it even more and get rid of the no with which the sentence now begins, and rewrite the sentence something like this. A true warm water fish could not exist in the Arctic and certainly could not thrive there. By making it a true warm water fish, now we've got words that could be inserted into that second clause and make sense. So now we've set up the sentence with an ellipsis, which does work. So remember, whenever you find yourself using an ellipsis, omitting a few words in order to save space in the sentence, make sure that the way you've written the sentence is such that the exact same words from one clause can be inserted in the other clause and still make sense. If not, you need to rethink the way you've written the sentence and either eliminate the ellipsis or make it correct. It's a rather tricky and subtle rule of correct writing in English, but a very important one, and one of the fine points in using parallelism correctly. Okay, let's take a look at an exercise that will give you a chance to test this rather subtle and difficult but important skill. In our first sentence, the author is trying to use a very simple form of ellipsis, and yet he's gotten it wrong, which shows just how tricky ellipsis can be. Let's think about the different ideas the author is trying to convey here. In accordance with the First Amendment to the Constitution, no state has or may enact a law establishing an official state religion. Okay, the author is talking about the First Amendment to the Constitution and is saying that as a result, two things have happened. One is that no state has enacted a law establishing an official state religion, and second, no state may enact such a law. Okay, but rather than repeat the verb enact, the author is trying to use ellipsis to eliminate the first enact. And so he has written, no state has or may enact a law establishing an official state religion. But remember the test. You need to be able to insert the exact same word that you've omitted from elsewhere in the sentence, plug it in, and have the sentence make sense. Now, the word that was omitted is enact. We see it right here in the sentence. When we try plugging it in, how does the sentence read? No state has enact or may enact a law establishing an official state religion. Now we see the problem, that with the helping verb has, we need the past participle enacted. And therefore, when we try to reinsert the omitted word enact, we see that the sentence doesn't really make sense. Remember that the word that you omit when you use ellipsis must be exactly the same in both places. So that doesn't work in this case. Probably the simplest way to correct the sentence would simply be to break down, go ahead and insert the word enacted, and the sentence will be a little longer, but not really much longer, and will certainly be grammatically correct. So the sentence would then read, in accordance with the First Amendment to the Constitution, no state has enacted or may enact a law establishing an official state religion. This is a correct way of writing the sentence, and it eliminates the erroneous attempt at ellipsis. Our next example. Many scientists agree about the causes of global warming, fewer about the best ways to combat it. Here again we have two parallel ideas. The first clause says many scientists agree about the causes of global warming. The second clause says that fewer scientists agree about the best ways to combat it. Now, the way I just said it spells out or fleshes out both clauses at full length. Perfectly understandable, but it's a little bit wordy. So the author of this version has tried to use ellipsis to shorten the sentence somewhat. Has he done the ellipsis correctly? Well, let's apply our test. We should be able to take the same words from the first clause, which were omitted in the second clause, and insert them into that second clause and have the sentence make sense. Now, what are the words that were omitted from the second clause? The words that were omitted are scientists agree. When we take those words from the first clause and insert them back into the second clause, does it read correctly? Many scientists agree about the causes of global warming. Fewer scientists agree about the best ways to combat it. Yes, it does make sense. It does read well, and the parallelism works. Therefore, the ellipsis, as done in this sentence, is perfectly correct. The author has simply not repeated the words scientists agree, has left them out. The resulting sentence is clear and easy to understand, and when we plug the exact same words back in, it all hangs together. Therefore, it passes the ellipsis test, it's perfectly correct, and this sentence doesn't need any fixing. Next example. Baseball pitcher Cy Young's lifetime record of 511 victories has never been challenged and probably never will. The author is saying two things about Cy Young's record. It has never been challenged and probably never will be challenged. Now, rather than repeat the word challenge, the author is trying to use ellipsis here. But what happens when we try to plug the same verb in? We see that the sentence doesn't really work. Baseball pitcher Cy Young's lifetime record of 511 victories has never been challenged and probably never will been challenged. You can see that doesn't sound right. The second clause here would demand the wording and probably never will be challenged, which is different from been challenged. So since we can't insert exactly the same words into that second part of the sentence, we see that the ellipsis rule has been violated. And therefore, you'd have to correct the sentence by spelling out that complete verb and make the sentence read, baseball pitcher Cy Young's lifetime record of 511 victories has never been challenged and probably never will be challenged. There's no way around it. You can't use ellipsis here because you can't omit exactly the same words. Instead, they are different words, and they have to be spelled out. Next example. As global trade increased, manufactured goods began to flow from north to south, raw materials from south to north. Once again, two closely related ideas talking about the flows of global trade. Now, certain words were omitted from the second clause just to save space and avoid needless repetition. The first clause says, manufactured goods began to flow from north to south. Those words began to flow are omitted from the second clause. When we insert those exact same words in the second clause, does it make sense? Raw materials began to flow from south to north. Yes, it does. So this passes the ellipsis rule. When you insert the omitted words, the sentence still makes sense and reads properly, and when they're omitted, the thing is clear and easy to understand. So once again, this is a sentence that has used ellipsis correctly and doesn't need any fixing. And our last example. The main legal barrier to an improved school system has been eliminated and the economic obstacles reduced. Let's use the same test. From the second clause here, the author has left out a couple of words, hoping to save space and make the sentence sound less repetitious. When we pick up the exact same words from the previous clause and insert them in the second clause, does it sound right? Does it make sense? Here's how it would then read. The main legal barrier to an improved school system has been eliminated, and the economic obstacles has been reduced. Okay, when we reinsert the helping verbs has been, which were left out or omitted from the second clause, we see that they don't quite work. The reason is that the subject of the first clause, barrier, is singular, but the subject of the second clause, obstacles, is plural, and therefore the helping verb has been doesn't work. We have to use have been instead. Therefore, we can't use ellipsis here because the exact same words can't be reinserted and make a correct sentence. Instead, this sentence has to be fixed by spelling out that second verb and therefore making the sentence a little less concise but more correct grammatically. The sentence would then read, "The main legal barrier to an improved school system has been eliminated and the economic obstacles have been reduced." So this is a sentence where ellipsis isn't really practical because we simply need different verbs to make the two clauses correct. Well, now you're an expert on the subject of parallel structure. Actually, if you find this a particularly challenging aspect of writing in English, don't feel bad. Many native English writers and speakers have difficulty with this, and in fact you'll probably find, if you read carefully in newspapers and magazines, a number of cases where professional writers make mistakes about parallel structure, because it can be rather tricky. In fact, when we get into the realm of parallel structure, as you've seen, we're moving beyond simple grammatical correctness into areas where topics such as logic and clarity become involved. Therefore, to use parallelism effectively, you really need to do more than just follow a couple of basic grammatical rules. Instead, you really need to think about what you're saying, to look at the relationships among the ideas that you're expressing in your sentences, and then make sure that the grammar mirrors and reflects those relationships clearly. If you do that and you think carefully about how the grammatical structure and the relationship among the ideas, how those things fit together, then you'll probably find that you can use parallel structure very effectively and even powerfully in your writing. Thanks for watching this program, and I'll look forward to seeing you out there for other programs in the Video Aided Instruction English Grammar Series.